Yeah, so I'm conscious of time and the 18-minute limit, but also wanting to give as much time for questions as possible. So I might go through this quite quickly. I'm conscious of having a lot of text, evidence, quotes, etc. on the slides.
I would say, Martha, I think we can go just a tiny bit over, so I wouldn't worry about rushing too much, just because I think after this we have a bit of a break, so I think we'll be able to extend the Q&A into the break a little bit and ensure that actually, because I don't really want to rush you too much, and yeah, I think it'll be really nice to have that a bit longer Q&A.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I was worried about there only being, 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A at the end, so that's good, thank you. Yeah, but if anyone would like to kind of have a copy of the PowerPoint to look through the quotes kind of in your own time, I'm happy to send that round to people. My Twitter is there, and I'll put my email address in the chat box after. So to get started, Jack Halberstam defines queer time as specific models of temporality that emerge in opposition to heteronormative narratives about youth, marriage, and child rearing, producing strange temporalities and imaginative eccentric life cycles. Queer time can also involve intergenerational exchange, as Nguyen Tan Hoang argues, focusing on the processes by which queer experience gets transmitted from one generation to the next. Both of these analyses of queer time have implications for my research, an oral history of bisexuality and attraction to multiple genders in 1970s and 1980s Britain. In this paper, I want to explore how bisexuality and multiple gender attraction can expand the critical utility of the concept of queer time, incorporating recent discussions of queer theory without anti-normativity to explore how queer time can be defined in ways that are not necessarily opposed to more normative life cycles. I'll also discuss the intergenerational dynamics of what Nguyen describes as queer pedagogy and the ways in which generation and popular memory were manifested in my interviews and the pre-existing oral history interviews that I listened to. So a large part of my research touched on the gay liberation movement in 1970s Britain and the relationship between gay liberation politics and attraction to multiple genders. One of my interviewees, Ossian, was involved in South London Gay Liberation Front during the 1970s. Echoing Halberstam's definition of queer time against heteronormativity, Ossian emphasised that GLF sought to challenge the patriarchy's institutions, which he defined as marriage, the family, and the class system. So for him, gay and straight referred less to the gender of one's partners than a wider binary of radical versus conservative politics. For example, he also described the more moderate campaign for homosexual equality as being straight. However, bisexuality and multiple gender attraction in the 1970s complicated this binary of gay and straight, or queer and heteronormative. Bisexuality was often understood by both bisexuals and non-bisexuals as a combination of heterosexuality and homosexuality, frequently expressed in numerical terms through percentages or ratios. When bisexuality was seen, therefore, as partially straight, it could be associated with the problems that GLF linked to being straight, such as conservatism and sexism. In terms of wider politics too, bisexual people who are in different gender, apparently heterosexual relationships were seen as particularly politically regressive. In the 1970s, these links were often made in the context of closetedness and invisibility, and particularly focused on men married to heterosexual women in so-called mixed marriages. In the 1980s, these fears continued, but were redirected more towards the threat of transmitting AIDS and the perceived incursion of men into women-only or lesbian-only spaces. There's, of course, a lot more that can be said about the relationship between bisexuality, multiple gender attraction, and gay liberation politics. And if you'll forgive a bit of self-promotion, I have an open access article in 20th Century British History that looks at that topic in much more detail. In the context of this paper, I want to focus on the ways in which attention to bisexuality and multiple gender attraction can cause us to expand or rethink the concept of queer time, or queer life narratives that are defined against heterosexuality and straightness. So does queer time have to exclude people in relationships perceived as straight, or who get married or have children? If this is the case, can attraction to multiple genders only be considered queer when it is visible and similar to homosexuality? I'll argue that, in fact, my interviewees were able to subvert normative linear life narratives, even when, and in fact, especially when, they were not visibly queer. Following Halberstam's concept of queer time, Amy Tooth Murphy has spoken about how the differences between a queer life cycle and the more traditional narratives related by heterosexual interviewees might inform the methods of queer oral historians. She argues that the use of normative frameworks to secure storytelling and interview encounters can lead to the inevitable failure of queer narrators to achieve narrative composure. And she questions whether queer oral historians should dispense with the traditional structure of life history interviewing that starts with childhood or parents. So although I generally describe my methodology as queer oral history, following Nanala Miller-Boyd and Horacio Enroque Ramirez's bodies of evidence, Boyd has also pointed out that the concept of a queer oral history is a fraught one. So in her own interviews about San Francisco, Boyd tried to avoid replicating a predictable narrative structure that focused on coming out in order to de-center gay identity from the heart of her project. The conventional lesbian and gay coming out narrative, moving from a sense of difference in childhood to a moment of realization to eventual community and acceptance, is intelligible, linear, essentialist, and therefore, she argues, not queer. Boyd recalls that her interviewees thwarted her queer priorities, and they worked hard to recenter gay identity as the space from which they could speak about themselves. For example, although she began asking about her interviewees' relationship to San Francisco, they often responded by describing their coming out story. She argues that this was because narrators knew the project was about gay and lesbian history and were therefore encouraged to map their memories onto an intelligible gay/lesbian narrative structure. Despite a researcher's best intentions then, the reliance of oral history on intelligible speakers may mean that it is impossible to achieve a truly queer oral history. That said, my experience with many of my interviewees ran counter to Boyd's. Although I did not want to center identity labels or coming out narratives, the beginning of my interviews did follow conventional narrative structures fairly closely. I began by asking questions about interviewees' childhood and family background. This was for a variety of reasons. My PhD was my first time conducting oral histories, and I was unsure how else to begin. I was also following the example of the Hall Carpenter Archives Oral History Project, which I'll discuss later in this paper, both for ease of comparison and because the Hall Carpenter interviews, had produced detailed and rich interviews. My efforts to avoid perpetuating conventional narratives came mostly in the sense that I generally didn't bring up sexuality until the interviewees did, and I deliberately didn't phrase it in terms of coming out, discovery, or realization. Despite this, I came to realize that if I could call my work queer oral history, it was more in the sense that I sought to find queer ways to analyze the results of my interviews, rather than my interview methodology itself being particularly queer. Despite my questionably queer methodology, many interviewees produced life stories which did differ from expected heteronormative or homonormative narratives. A key example of this is in the rejection of coming out stories from many of my male interviewees. One interviewee, Nigel, said, "I just can't be bothered. It comes back to that privacy versus openness thing." Another interviewee, Neil, referenced the fact that bisexuality is often hypersexualized, saying, "I've still not declared to my kids or my family that I'm bisexual, but I'm thinking, well, does it matter? In the same way, I don't think I'd declare to them that I'm interested in shibari, a type of erotic rope bondage, or flogging somebody." For Neil, his bisexual identity was closely linked to his interest in BDSM and kink, and both were something that he didn't want to disclose to his children. Both of those interviewees were in primary relationships with women, which meant that it was easier for them to pass as straight in the context of their relationships. Although that fact could support some of the criticisms made of bisexual men during the 1970s, which I touched on before, the idea that they were just cowardly, closeted, taking advantage of their female partners, I want to argue that their invisibility and their apparently heterosexual relationships actually enabled them to subvert homonormative narratives about identity and outness, rejecting that linear essentialism. This point was also echoed by Ossian, who had come out when in GLF, but retrospectively criticised it, saying, "If I hadn't come out, I could have argued the gay lib case with my dad. But once I'd come out, it was like you couldn't say anything, the words were taken out of my mouth." In addition to specific discussions of coming out, many of my interviewees' life narratives were non-linear in that they'd identified in multiple ways across their lifetimes. This was the case even though they didn't necessarily follow Halberstam's concept of queer time, by rejecting marriage and child rearing. Of course, it's possible to tell a linear story of coming out as bisexual after identifying as gay or lesbian, a story where gay or lesbian identity is a sort of false consciousness before discovering their true selves. However, many of my interviewees actually explicitly rejected this narrative. For example, Curtis talked about how he continued to identify as gay for a while, even after he had started being attracted to and sleeping with women. Chrissy described herself as having periods of being gay, then being straight, and being gay, then being straight, while another interviewee, Vera's narrative, was inherently non-linear. She came out as bisexual, then as lesbian, then as bisexual again. Other interviewees didn't identify as bisexual at the time of our interview, but felt that my analysis of multiple gender attraction included them as well. Judith described her sexual behaviour in the past as being bisexual, but said that even when she'd been in relationships with men, she had identified herself as a lesbian who happens to be sleeping with a man at the moment. Elsa described herself as having been heterosexual in the past, but at the time of our interview identified as lesbian. Both Elsa and Judith said that this was for political reasons, in that their lesbian identity was closely linked to their feminist politics. So those political explanations resisted essentialist narratives of discovering an inherent truth of identity. I want to say I'm not trying to suggest at this point that bisexuality and attraction to multiple genders is uniquely complex, surprising, or queer. As Claire Hemmings points out, insisting on bisexuality as transgression often lacks critical reflection and means that bisexuals' own exclusions cannot be recognised and thus addressed. I do, however, want to argue that these interviews demonstrate how, by incorporating bisexuality and multiple gender attraction, queer time can be used to radically reconfigure the nature of straight, sex, and reproductive time rather than necessarily reject it. In the next part of this paper, I'll discuss Nguyen's conceptualization of queer time as intergenerational queer pedagogy. Oral history is often an intergenerational encounter, and this was the case for my interviews. Often interviewees highlighted the generational differences between us as a way to convey change over time. However, their understanding of these generational changes varied. Ossian, born in 1954, told me that he thought the millenniums of today were the heirs to GLF's political work, without the baggage that GLF members had experienced that had prevented them from being fully liberated. This was exemplified for him by what he saw as a rejection of labels by young people. Halberstam criticises young people's apparent rejection of identity categories, saying, as those same identity categories represent the activist labours of previous generations. However, in this instance at least, older generations were themselves praising the fluidity and progressiveness of younger generations. Ossian was reinscribing generational boundaries in order to fit a narrative of progressive change over time, and perhaps as an effort to flatter me as a younger interviewer. Nigel, born in 1963, had a slightly more complicated assessment of generation. He thought that young people today find coming out much easier to do, and said that it's almost like nowadays young people can be queer, but older people can't. However, he also felt that the generation older than his, people aged 70 and over, were also absolutely fine with it. His generation was therefore, he felt, an outlier, which he attributed to their experience of AIDS, in contrast to the younger generation whom he felt don't even know what the AIDS crisis was. This was said with a sense of frustration that younger people did not engage with history, but this frustration was complicated by his argument that this apparent historical ignorance enabled young people to be more comfortable and confident in their sexuality. Another interviewee, Alison, born in 1967, described a generational difference that she thought was characterised by ignorance from school children who she'd worked with, the idea that bi is binary. Other conversations about generation had implicitly involved me as a representative of the younger generation. But in this instance, there was some distance between myself as an interviewer and the younger generation that Alison was referring to, who were teenagers 5 to 10 years younger than me. Alison therefore seemed to be implicitly grouping herself and myself together as adults who understand the historical implications of the term bi. In contrast, some of my older interviewees saw me as so clearly representative of younger generations that they sought confirmation from me about their sense of change over time. For example, Elsa, born in 1951, asked whether I thought bisexuality exists anymore. And Gwen, also born in 1951, asked whether I thought the activism she'd been involved in during the 1970s was worth it. In both of those instances, I faltered and my answers were vague and non-committal. This was partly because I was worried my answers might prejudice their own recollections, but also by asking me to account for my generational experience and current affairs, These interviewees explicitly reiterated those generational boundaries and differences, while at the same time subverting the boundary and power dynamic between questioner and questioned. Finally, I want to discuss queer time as it relates to another aspect of oral history, the multiple timeframes that oral histories bring into consideration. These become even more complex when using pre-existing oral histories. As I mentioned previously, in addition to conducting my own interviews in 2018 and 2019, I also listened to pre-existing oral history interviews from the Hall Carpenter Archives Oral History Project. The project began in 1985 and conducted 117 interviews with gay men and lesbians in the 1980s and 1990s, seeking to recover what is hidden, neglected, or dismissed by the traditional focus of history. Criticising the reuse of qualitative data, Odette Parry and Natasha Morthner argue that subsequent researchers do not have the same knowledge about the context of the original data collection, to the extent that it becomes impossible to draw meaningful conclusions. In many ways, my experience of using the Hall Carpenter interviews echoed these concerns. I was able to access tape recordings of the interviews and read archive descriptions with varying levels of detail. The limitations of this contextual information meant that I found myself with questions that it was impossible to answer, such as about how interviewees were recruited or research questions formulated. Some historians who've used pre-existing oral histories, such as April Galway and Malin Thor-Turabee, have attempted to answer some of these questions by interviewing people involved in the original project. However, this isn't always possible. The emphasis on collective decision-making and co-ownership by the Hall Carpenter Lesbian Oral History Group and Gay Men's Oral History Group meant that the individual members of these groups were often anonymous. In the specific context of interviews with lesbians and gay men in the 1980s and 1990s, the AIDS epidemic also casts a shadow over these sources, tragically constraining historians' ability to speak to individual members of the project and find out about their approaches firsthand. While acknowledging the frustrations and uncertainties that come with this distance from the original project, I therefore think it's necessary, particularly as scholars of queer history, to find a more positive argument about using pre-existing oral histories that doesn't revolve solely around mitigating drawbacks. Although the differences between my position as a researcher in the 21st century and the context of the original interviews in the 1980s and 1990s pose difficulties, they also have benefits. The use of pre-existing oral histories allows me to address several different timeframes at once. Firstly, of course, the Hall Carpenter interviewees were remembering the 20th century, including the 1970s and 1980s, the period my research focused on. Secondly, as the interviews were conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, they are themselves primary sources, providing an insight into the late 20th century context. There's then the additional temporal context of 2018 and 2019, the context in which I was listening to and interpreting the Hall Carpenter interviews, as well as conducting and interpreting my own interviews. So I think this is particularly relevant because the present moment of the late 2010s was a constant presence in my interviews. In some cases, as with reflections on generational difference, interviewees referred to the present moment to emphasize change over time, for instance, in relation to the internet and social media. In other cases, interviewees sought to demonstrate continuity over time or a cyclical idea of time. Alison likened rhetoric about trans people to the stigmatization of gay people during Section 28, while Lisa compared the transphobia that's going around now to the lesbian sex wars of the 1980s over SM and pornography. Neve Moore, who takes a more positive approach to reusing qualitative data, argues that it is important to develop a more creative and even messy approach. This is reminiscent of Laura Doan's argument that negotiating the past in relation to gender and sexuality forces us to raise our tolerance for conceptual messiness. Using pre-existing oral histories could therefore be seen as a queer methodology because it forces us to accept messiness and unknowability and allows for queer pedagogy across multiple generations. The Hall Carpenter interviews are not simply a supplement to my own interviews, they help to explore temporal boundaries and interrogate the ways in which the present moment affects my interviewees. So to conclude, in relation to queer life narratives, I argue that multiple gender attraction can expand the radical meaning of queer time, extending its challenge to normativity by incorporating and complicating, rather than rejecting, normativity's most hallowed turf, child rearing, straight sex, and the like. In relation to ideas about intergenerational queer pedagogy, I want to emphasize the importance of multiple timeframes and the use of pre-existing oral histories as part of this. My interviewees' varying assessments of generational difference and the complexity of comparing them to the Hall Carpenter interviews requires acknowledging, in Doan's words, the unknowability and indeterminacy of the sexual past. Thank you.